Tonight, I'll softly tell you the true story of the Casket Girls of New Orleans, a slow, atmospheric tale where myth speaks of vampires, but the real haunting lives in poverty, forced marriages, and quiet sorrow. Now, get comfortable. Let your shoulders soften. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the sounds of the night carry you to the banks of the Mississippi. Let's begin. On a gray October morning in 1728, just after the bells of Le Havre had marked 8 o'clock, a French ship slipped away from the fog-softened harbor and turned its bow toward the far, unseen mouth of the Mississippi River. On its deck stood a small cluster of young women, shawls pulled tight, skirts snapping weakly in the wind. Each of them pressed close to a wooden chest that was taller than their waists and narrow like a sleeping place. The officials called them filles à la cassette, girls with caskets. Though the chests were not coffins, only long boxes meant to carry the whole of a life. A folded dress for feast days, a rosary, a comb of cheap bone, a worn letter, a scrap of lace. To the dock workers watching from shore, the silhouettes of the chests looked unsettlingly like upright coffins, pale wood catching the last smears of harbor light. It was enough for a murmur to begin, soft as the tide that followed the ship out of the port. On the damp planks, one girl steadied herself, fingers brushing the iron handle of her chest. She had left a stone village where the soil gave little, and the winters had begun to carve new hollows into her parents' faces. A priest had spoken of opportunity, of good Catholic husbands in a distant colony, of decent houses and warm kitchens, and the chance to raise children under a gentler sun. The words had sounded like mercy. Only later had the cost taken shape. The final walk away from her mother's doorway, the hurried blessing, the rough kiss on the forehead, the knowledge that the ocean would lie between them forever. Around her, the other girls clung to similar hopes, or at least to the idea that hope was possible. Some were orphans, their lives already narrowed by hunger and the rules of charitable institutions. Some had families too poor to keep them, signed away with trembling hands and smudged ink. None of them truly knew what waited beyond the Atlantic, only that France had decided their future no longer lay within its borders. As the coastline receded, the ship entered a long rhythm of days measured by the creak of timbers, the groan of ropes, the shift and slap of water against the hull. The air grew warmer, saltier, thick with the smell of tar, sweat, wet wood, and the faint sweetness of rotting fruit. The girls slept in cramped quarters below, their narrow chests lashed in place nearby, as if their few possessions might slip away into the dark waves if left unattended. At night, when the sea was calm and the sky clear, some crept up to the deck to breathe. Stars spilled overhead, uncountable, and the black water reflected them in broken jewels. In such moments, the distance from home felt immeasurable, as though they had stepped off the edge of the world and were suspended now between past and future, neither one within reach. Whispers moved among the sailors about their cargo of brides. Some spoke crudely, others with a superstitious unease. The sight of so many tall, coffin-shaped chests, all in a row, unsettled them in ways they did not admit aloud. Human imagination rarely leaves a clean space empty. It fills it with shadows of its own making. Somewhere between the departure and the low, hot shores of Louisiana, a story began to stir, thin as mist. That these were no ordinary girls, and the chests they guarded so closely were not meant for clothing at all. The ship sailed on, through storms that hammered the deck, and days of hovering heat when even breath felt heavy. The girls learned the taste of brackish water, the ache of legs unused to walking anywhere but the short stretch between bunk and stair. They also learned silence, the kind that comes when fear has said everything it can say and is now content to sit and watch. Weeks later, when at last the air turned heavy with river damp, and the water under the ship changed from restless sea to the slower, brown-green sweep of the Mississippi, they gathered along the rail. Ahead, beyond curtains of mist and marsh, New Orleans waited. A half-built city of wooden houses, muddy streets, and a convent that had set aside rooms for them. The day was not marked by any festival or heralded by trumpets. It was simply another morning in the long unfolding of the colony's history. And yet, for these women, it was the quiet dividing line between the life behind and the life ahead. Their chests were hoisted onto the dock, long, pale shapes swinging briefly above the water before thudding down. From the shore, the watching eyes of men, priests, soldiers, and merchants took in the strange little procession of girls in caskets. The rumor that had been born at sea found new breath on land. By late afternoon that same day, when the sun hung low and wide over the slow curve of the river, the girls were led through the streets of New Orleans toward the Ursuline convent. The town smelled of mud, horses, fish, and something else they could not yet name. The sour, sweet scent of standing water under relentless heat. Mosquitoes drifted in delicate swarms above ditches. Spanish moss trailed from the branches of live oaks like gray, uncombed hair. The convent rose above the settlement with the pale, solid presence of a guardian. Its walls were thick, its courtyard shaded, its small chapel holding a coolness that felt almost like another climate. For the girls, crossing the threshold was a temporary return to the kind of enclosure they understood. Rules written on neat pages, prayers at fixed hours, women in habits whose faces carried both sternness and compassion. Each casket was hauled into an upper room and lined along the walls, their lids waiting to be lifted. Inside lay the fullness of each girl's material self, such as it was. A linen shift rolled tight, a worn pair of shoes, a small icon, a ribbon saved from childhood, a rosary that had passed between fingers too many times to count. The nuns moved among them, practical and reassuring, taking inventory, assigning bunks, explaining that for a little while these rooms would be a kind of harbor. Soon enough, the colony's men would come, farmers from outlying concessions, soldiers, clerks, artisans, each holding a petition for a wife. In the evenings, when the sun bled out of the sky and the air grew thicker, the heavy shutters of the convent's upper windows were closed and barred. The gesture was ordinary, protection from storms, from prying eyes, from the restless life of the docks. But it did not look ordinary to the people outside. Those shutters, tall and pale, sealed the rooms where the girls in their long chests slept. Seen from the street, the windows looked like blind eyes. Sailors passing below told one another that they never saw the girls by day except under the watchful escort of a nun, and never by night at all. Some said the convent windows were opened only at the darkest hours, when candles glowed behind them and shadows moved in ways that seemed too swift, too slender, too unnatural. Others swore that when the moon was high and the streets empty, the shutters shifted just enough to reveal pale fingers resting on the sill. Inside, the truth was less sensational and more quietly heartbreaking. The girls spent their days learning the customs of the colony, the skills needed to keep a household standing in a climate that rotted wood and soured flour. They practiced their letters so they could write back to families who might never answer. At night, conversations softened into whispered stories of home, a stone well, a patch of garden behind a cottage, the sound of a particular church bell on winter evenings. The nuns watched over them with a mix of discipline and pity. They had seen other groups of brides arrive before, watched them be chosen, watched some return briefly with bruises hidden under sleeves, or eyes that no longer held much light. They also knew how the colony spoke of the girls when they were not present. Rumors of loose morals, or of witchcraft, or of some dark bargain made with the king's government to populate these faraway lands. On certain evenings, the wind carried faint fragments of street gossip up to the convent's walls. People said the caskets the girls had brought were shaped like coffins, because they were coffins, that they slept inside them during the day and emerged only at night. They said the shutters were sealed not to keep danger out, but to keep something in. The story shifted with each telling, picking up pieces of old European fears: vampires, restless spirits, women who were not quite women, but something hungrier. None of this reached the girls in any clear way. They knew only the press of humid air in the dormitories, the soreness of feet unused to colonial shoes, the nervous rhythm of days spent waiting to be called downstairs and shown to a man whose name they might have heard once, whose world would become their world, whether they wished it or not. The true mystery, invisible to the town, lay in that waiting, in the narrowing horizon of choice, in the way a young woman's future could be folded up and handed to her like a document already signed. In the months that followed, the convent's upper rooms slowly emptied. One by one, the girls stepped out through the high archway at the gate, veils smoothed, hands folded, caskets loaded onto carts or balanced on shoulders. They rode away beside men whose faces were taut with a mix of hope, nervousness, and calculation. Some went upriver to rough concessions where sugarcane or indigo strained against the soil. Others traveled along muddy tracks to settlements where the forest still pressed close, the line between wilderness and habitation only a thin, trembling edge. Life in these places was harder than any of the girls had been told. Houses leaned on rotting posts, roofs leaked, the air thrummed with insects. Work was endless: mending, cooking, caring for children, nursing husbands sickened by fevers that rose fast and burned out slowly, when they burned out at all. Under the blanket of Spanish law and the French crown, there was little room for a woman to step aside from the role assigned her. Their chests, once symbols of a fragile dignity, became battered fixtures in corners of dim rooms. Some were turned into benches or storage, lids propped open to hold blankets and sacks. The grain of the wood darkened with humidity, with the touch of hands that were too busy to be gentle. In more than one house, a child climbed inside to hide during games, laughing in a way that softened the unsettling shape into something more ordinary. Yet the rumors in the city did not dwindle. They ripened. Each outbreak of sickness, each sudden death in the humid months, each failure of a crop found a place inside the growing legend of the Casket Girls. People said the women who had arrived with their coffin-like chests brought misfortune with them. The tale reached across decades, layering itself onto new generations who no longer remembered the real hunger that had driven their mothers from France. Only the lingering sense that something unnatural had crossed the ocean. Stories spread of men who had married these brides and wasted away, of households where children sickened without cause, of shadows that seemed to linger near windows long after candles were blown out. In the telling, the women became both victims and suspects, figures onto whom the colony poured its unease about death, disease, and the strange, swamp-soft land it was still trying to claim. Back in the convent, the nuns occasionally received letters written in halting, careful script. Some spoke of contentment, of husbands who worked hard and listened, of children who learned to run barefoot through cane fields, laughing. Others wrapped their sorrow in politeness, describing difficulties and lonely circumstances that hinted at something harsher: isolation, unkindness, hands that did not always stop at the edge of anger. These letters seldom reached anyone else. They stayed folded in quiet drawers, their ink fading slowly in the same heat that yellowed the paper. Outside those drawers, the myth continued to build its own archive in the minds of townspeople who preferred a more thrilling explanation. By the mid-19th century, when New Orleans had grown into a city of balconies and gas lamps and music, the older stories fused with newer fears. The Ursuline convent's shutters, still closed each evening out of simple habit, became central props in a performance the city was now staging for itself. Guides pointed up at them and lowered their voices. Visitors shivered theatrically. Children dared each other to stand under the windows at midnight and look up. Few of them considered how many real women's lives had played out behind those walls. The weary steps on stone stairs, the silent tears in tiny cells, the fragile friendships held together in the spaces between duties. The mystery people chose was the one with teeth and blood, not the quieter kind that asks how a person learns to live in a place she never chose, with a man she barely knew, while her name is being reshaped into something monstrous on other people's tongues. By the late 1800s, when paddle steamers churned the river into wide, foaming wakes, and electric lights began to push back the darkness in the French Quarter, the legend of the Casket Girls had become a comfortable part of the city's nocturnal wardrobe. It slipped on easily whenever the air cooled and conversation turned toward things half believed and half enjoyed, Tourists arriving from northern states or from across the Atlantic were eager for tales that made New Orleans feel older, stranger, more haunted than the places they had left. Local storytellers obliged, pointing toward the Ursuline convent, whose facade had watched the river's slow changes for more than a century and a half. They spoke of mysterious women shipped in crates shaped like coffins, of nuns who discovered the boxes empty except for a dark presence, of shutters that had to be sealed with blessed nails to keep something unwholesome inside. On balconies draped with ironwork, under the lazy swing of hanging ferns, people repeated these stories with a relish that blurred the line between fear and entertainment. The humid night carried their words down side streets and along the levee, folding them into the music of distant fiddles and the clop of passing horses. The Casket girls became less a set of individuals and more a single floating figure, pale, unsmiling, stepping silently through centuries without changing. The real history remained deeper in the sediment of the city's memory. Records noted the ships that had brought the brides, the lists of names and small dowries, the convent's role in housing and supervising them, the marriages recorded soon after. Parish registers traced some of their later lives in matter-of-fact entries. A baptism here, a burial there, a brief mention of a widow moving inland after her husband's death. No one wrote down the hours each woman spent alone in a half-built house while her husband labored elsewhere, or the exact weight of the air on nights when fever bent his spine and soaked the sheets. No one recorded how often she thought of the stone street where she had once played as a child, or whether she ever stopped dreaming in French. As time passed, even the sorrow blurred. New generations walked the same streets, thinking of the convent only as a place with a good story attached, a point of interest on a map of spectral curiosities. The city itself, with its long memory for music and short patience for quiet suffering, seemed to prefer it that way. Yet the river kept a slower record. Its brown water flowed past the old walls day after day, carrying silt from places far upriver, from fields where descendants of those early brides still worked, from bayous where their grandchildren listened to new stories under different stars. In the mutable surface of the water, reflections of the convent's shutters wavered and stretched. At certain angles, for a moment, they looked almost like tall, narrow chests, floating. On some evenings, when the light was low and the air heavy with the smell of rain that had not yet fallen, a person standing quietly by the levee might feel a different kind of haunting rise from the past. Not the sudden chill of an imagined vampire at the window, but a slower ache, the sense of lives rerouted and reduced, of choices made in faraway rooms that never felt the heat of this place. The story people preferred said that something unnatural had come to New Orleans, sealed inside wooden caskets. The story the city seldom told itself was that what had truly arrived were dozens of very young women with nothing but a trunk and a promise that their suffering would be useful to someone else. On a mild spring evening in the early 1900s, just after 10 o'clock, when the lamps along Chartres Street burned with a soft, gaslit steadiness, and the river carried a shimmer of distant, reflected stars, the Ursuline convent stood as it always had. White walls, steep roof, tall windows with shutters closed like folded hands. Inside, the routines of the sisters were much the same as they had been in the 18th century. Prayers, work, the small domestic tasks that keep any building, sacred or ordinary, from falling into quiet ruin. The city beyond their walls had changed shape and tempo many times, but the convent kept its slow heartbeat. Guides still led small groups to its gates and gestured toward the shutters, their voices dropping into familiar cadences. They spoke of immortality, of undying hunger, of nails blessed by bishops to hold back an ancient threat. Their listeners nodded, some amused, some sincerely unsettled, their eyes tracing the dark lines of the closed wooden panels high above. The real casket girls were long gone. Some lay in graveyards scattered along the river, their stones worn to near illegibility. Others had no markers at all. Their bodies returned to the damp earth of forgotten plots behind rural chapels. Their descendants walked the city streets without always knowing exactly whose courage, desperation, or resignation had helped place them there. If the chests they had carried still existed, they were no longer recognizable as vessels of myth. Perhaps one rested in an attic somewhere, its lid warped, a blanket thrown carelessly over it. Perhaps another had been broken down for lumber, its planks nailed into a chicken coop or a fence. Wood forgets its shapes, but it remembers, in a way, every hand that has held it, every object laid gently or hastily inside. The legend persisted because it was tidy. It turned a messy history of colonization, gender, faith, and survival into a story with sharp teeth and simple edges. It let people shiver and then laugh and then go on with their evening. The truth asked more, that they imagined the heavy air in those dormitories, the sound of girls crying quietly into pillows, the moment when each one stepped out of the convent, knowing she was walking toward a life she had not chosen. Standing at a distance, looking up at the shuttered windows, it is possible to feel both stories at once. The invented one flutters brightly on the surface. Coffin-shaped chests, pale girls who never age, an invisible presence pressing against the wood. Beneath it, darker and deeper, lies the quieter haunting of real lives, the ache of separation from home, the uncertainty of strange landscapes, the slow wearing down of hope under the weight of expectation. In the soft hours when the city begins to settle, and the last music from the quarter fades to a murmur, the convent seems almost to breathe. The shutters, though unmoving, hold a patience that has watched generations pass. If there are ghosts here, they are not creatures of fangs and endless thirst, but impressions of footsteps on stone, of hands resting for a moment on the cool edge of a narrow chest before lifting it again. The Mississippi flows on, indifferent and attentive at once, carrying past the old walls the faint echoes of everything the city chooses to remember and everything it prefers to forget. Somewhere between the myth told to entertain and the history traced in faint ink, the Casket girls continue to walk, young, tired, hopeful, afraid. Their story lingers not in the fear that they might rise from coffins, but in the knowledge that they crossed an ocean with only a wooden box and the fragile belief that their suffering might be the price of a better life. In the hush of night, with the sound of distant water and the creak of shutters settling into their frames, that knowledge is its own kind of gentle, enduring